Well, you know, from the heights of grace now, let's move down to the depths of sin. As a child, you had an awareness of sin. You mentioned in the memoir a couple
Yeah.
incidents, and two stay in my mind. One was an incident of looking down into the basement with a bunch of other children and intentionally knocking another kid so that he
I
fell
did.
in.
I did do that.
You mentioned going into a nursery and sort of wantonly destroying some flowers without any
Right.
real reason. It reminds me of Augustine in his Confessions when he talks about going into the orchard of someone else and stealing the pears. And if my memory serves me right, he really didn't even want the pears. It was the act
No,
of stealing that
it
he
was
wanted.
the act, yeah. We broke into this hothouse behind this florist and we just plucked these expensive orchids off the stems and we pushed them down our shirts and ran out. It was mischief. It was mayhem. And those orchids in those days sold for about $7 a piece, which was a lot of money. I mean, that was a time when you could work all week and maybe make $7. And they sold as corsages for kids who went to proms and dances. And I remember doing that, and I remember the thrill of doing that. I remember the glamour of evil,
Yes.
the glamour of that rebellion against authority. And of course, the other incident where I pushed the boy, that was a very serious incident. I pushed that boy down a drop of about 8 feet at least. And he could have been really, really seriously hurt. And I wonder to this day where he is and what he thinks about that mean little girl who just pushed him to see what would happen. But it gave me a real insight into what sin is, because I was conscious at that moment of doing something evil. Now, thank heaven, I got the grace to know the minute I saw that boy's face that I had done a terrible thing. And I resolved I would never do something like that again to a person. Never, just to see what would happen. Never would I hurt a human being like that. And that's why I think the incident has stayed in my mind. I've thought about it, oh, gee, I must think about it once a month, you know, about pushing that boy and about the look of horror on his face when he looked up at me like, how could you do this to me? And I did want to mention it in the memoir because I think it's important for us to talk about sin, and sin in terms of ourselves. We Christians talk much too much about sin in terms of somebody else. I wanted to talk about what I'd done, you know, in 2 instances. And of course, the third thing that I mentioned in the memoir, which I think is really important, is if I could change anything about my life, it would be to take back every unkind word I ever said to anybody, whether it was careless or deliberate. Those are the things I remember with special regret. And the reason that I feel so bad about it is because I can remember so many things that people said that hurt me. I can remember back to being 6 or 7 or 8 years old and being brutally hurt by something somebody said. And I think, well, gee, if I feel that way about what that little girl said to me that day, how many other people did I affect in that way? How many people, you know, was I mean to? And it brings home to me the message of what Christ means when he says, love your enemies. He means be loving, be kind, don't be cruel, don't say mean things. I mean, anyway, I felt I had to put that in the memoir. I had to talk about sin, and I had to talk about it in that very real way.
And even here, as you refer to the, you know, the glamour of evil, which is so deceptive, and in the baptism rite, we pray for that.
Right.
Do you refuse to be mastered by sin? Do you reject the glamour of
Do you
evil?
reject the glamour of evil? Yeah.
Interestingly, when you left the church, you left over an issue of knowledge. There were things that you wanted to know.
Right.
Excuse me. That you felt the church didn't want you to delve into as a young, growing up Catholic woman.
Right.
I had to be reminded of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And the one thing they can't do is eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I
And
guess
it's the one thing they want.
I didn't think of that. That seems so obvious, and I didn't think of it. That's amazing. But that is what I wanted. I wanted to go out and I wanted to read, and I wanted to read all the existentialists and all the atheists and all the nihilists and all the people all the writers that had come out of the experience of the First and Second World War. I wanted to know what all that was about. And I stopped talking to God. I made that awful mistake. I stopped talking to God. I felt if I can't be a Catholic and read all these books, then maybe God doesn't exist. And I gave in to that temptation much too easily.
You said something very interesting in the memoir. In my experience, people who leave the church get angry with the church and then they leave God. You said in order for you to leave the church, you had to leave God.
That was right.
And
That was correct. I didn't think about it too much. I remember, you know what I remember more than anything is the pain, the agony of it, the agony of it, the fear that if I didn't go out and I didn't find out what the world was about, I was going to be a fool. I was going to miss life. I was going to miss the point. And that my church couldn't be the true church. It was just too narrow. It was too suffocating. It was too small. I mean, there was a great big world out there in which 2/3 of the world weren't Catholic. I mean, you know, and I was afraid. I was afraid of missing the boat of life. And the mistake I made, the big mistake I think, is I stopped talking to God about it. I should have gone right in there and knelt down and talked to him and said, help me with this. Help me figure this out. There must be some way to do this. I mean, it doesn't have to be this rigid a break, does it?